This is a completely fictional cinematic story created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, organizations, and events are entirely fictional. Ethan Caldwell reached across the white linen tablecloth and tucked a loose strand of hair behind Vanessa Hale's ear. A gesture so casual, so practiced, that it told Olivia everything she needed to know about how long this had been going on. He was laughing at something Vanessa said, his hand resting over hers, his wedding ring catching the candlelight like a small, stupid joke. Olivia stood at the entrance of Claridge's Manhattan, one of the most expensive restaurants in the city, still wearing her coat, still holding her clutch, and she did not move. She did not make a sound. She simply looked at her husband of 11 years sitting across from another woman as though the rest of the world had ceased to exist. And she made a decision. Hulk, if this story already has your heart racing, you are exactly where you need to be. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss what comes next, because this story is only getting started. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to that restaurant. The reservation had been Olivia's idea. She had called Claridge's Manhattan 3 weeks earlier and asked for the private dining room, the one on the second floor with the frosted glass panels and the view of Fifth Avenue, because Ethan had mentioned somewhere between a Tuesday work call and a Thursday business trip that he wanted to celebrate. His firm had just closed a deal with a private equity group out of Boston, the kind of deal he had been chasing for 2 years, and he said they should do something nice, something that matched the moment. Olivia had said yes without thinking twice. She had booked the room, confirmed the menu, arranged for a bottle of Barolo to be opened and breathing by 7:30. She had even, and this part would sting her later, not with grief, but with something sharper and more humiliating, stopped at a jewelry store on Lexington Avenue that afternoon to pick up the watch she'd had engraved as a gift. To E. You built this. O. She had arrived 40 minutes early because she wanted everything to be right. The hostess at the front had smiled and told her the private room was occupied, that a reservation had come in that morning under a different name, and the manager had rerouted it. She'd apologized, offered a table on the main floor instead. Olivia had thanked her, asked for a moment, and stepped back toward the entrance to call Ethan's phone. He didn't answer. She tried again. Still nothing. The restaurant was full, the kind of Thursday night crowd that wore money quietly. Older couples who didn't need to perform, a few younger ones who did, a table of finance men in the corner who laughed too loud. Olivia walked through the main room slowly, scanning, because she had learned a long time ago not to assume. You check first. You make sure you're seeing what you think you're seeing before you do anything at all. She saw him at a window table near the back. He was facing away from the entrance, which was why he hadn't seen her come in. Vanessa Hale was facing him, and therefore, without realizing it, facing Olivia, and she looked exactly the way Olivia had always suspected she might look in a moment like this. Relaxed, comfortable, like she belonged there. She was laughing, her chin tilted down in that particular way women laugh when they want a man to feel like the funniest person in the room, and Ethan was leaning forward with his elbow on the table and his jacket pushed up at the sleeves. Olivia recognized the jacket. She had bought it for him. Brioni, charcoal, from a trip to Milan 2 years ago, when they had still been doing things like taking trips to Milan together. She stood there for what felt like a very long time, but was probably less than 15 seconds. Then she walked to the bar, sat down on a stool near the far end where the sightlines were good, and ordered a glass of still water. The bartender asked if she wanted anything else. She said no, thank you, and set her clutch on the bar and took out her phone. She was not crying. She noticed that about herself, that the thing she felt was not grief, not yet, and maybe not ever. It was more like clarity, the particular sharpening that happens when something you have half known for a long time finally steps out of the shadows and stands in front of you under good lighting. She scrolled to her contacts and found the number for her personal attorney, Margaret Chu. It was 7:43 in the evening. Margaret picked up on the second ring. Olivia. Not a greeting exactly. Margaret had been her attorney for 9 years and had learned to read the weight in Olivia's voice the way a doctor reads a chart. I need you to initiate the financial separation protocol, Olivia said. Everything we discussed, the trusts, the accounts, the property structures, all of it. A short pause. Tonight? As soon as you can legally move. Another pause, this one longer. Are you all right? I'm sitting at the bar at Claridge's watching my husband have dinner with Vanessa Hale. She said it the way you'd read a weather report. So no, but I'm functional. Margaret said, give me an hour. Olivia said, take 40 minutes. She hung up, finished her water, and thought carefully about what she was going to do next. The watch was still in her bag, the box tucked into the inside pocket, the ribbon slightly crushed from the commute. She considered it for a moment. Then she ordered a glass of the Barolo she'd had waiting upstairs in a room that was no longer hers, because she had paid for it, and she might as well drink it. The sommelier brought it over and poured. She swirled it once without thinking, the way you do when the motion has become muscle memory, and she watched Ethan across the room. He touched Vanessa's hand again. The ring caught the light again. Olivia drank her wine. She waited until Vanessa excused herself. She could tell by the way the woman rose, touched Ethan briefly on the shoulder, and moved toward the back of the restaurant toward the restrooms. She waited another 30 seconds after that. Then she picked up her clutch, smoothed her coat, and walked across the main dining room toward her husband's table. Ethan was looking at his phone when she arrived. He was smiling at something on the screen. Hi, Olivia said. He looked up. The color left his face so completely and so quickly that it was almost medically interesting. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. He looked at her, then at the chair across from him where Vanessa had been sitting, then back at Olivia, and she could actually watch him run through his options in real time. The denials, the explanations, the particular architecture of a lie assembled under pressure, and she felt nothing except a mild, tired curiosity about which one he would choose. Olivia. He said her name like it was a question. You didn't answer your phone, she said. She pulled out the chair across from him, Vanessa's chair, and sat down. She rested her clutch on the table. She did not raise her voice. The couple at the nearest table, maybe 8 feet away, did not look up. I was going to call you back. He stopped, started again. This isn't Ethan. Her voice was even. Stop. He stopped. I'm not going to scream at you, she said. I'm not going to make a scene. You know me well enough to know that. She folded her hands on the table. But I need you to understand something that has already happened, so that when Vanessa comes back from the bathroom and you try to figure out what to do next, you have the correct information. He was staring at her. His jaw was tight. She could see the vein in his temple that appeared when he was frightened, the one she used to notice during arguments and feel guilty about, as though his discomfort were her fault for pointing out the truth. I just got off the phone with Margaret Chu, she said. By morning, the accounts connected to the Sterling Trust will be fully separated from any access you have. The Fifth Avenue apartment, which, as you know, is held in my family's trust, not in both our names, will be changing its access codes and its authorized residents list by the end of the week. She paused. The car lease on the Bentley is paid through a subsidiary of the trust. That will be redirected. The Hamptons house is the same structure. The membership at West Haven Club is registered to my family, not to you. Ethan had gone very still. The corporate line of credit that your firm has been using since 2019, she continued, the one that allowed you to absorb the Decker Group loss without your investors finding out, that facility is also connected to the Sterling Trust. My attorneys will be contacting your CFO tomorrow morning. She watched him process this. She watched him understand. Olivia, he said. His voice had changed. The shock was giving way to something harder, something she recognized. The particular tone he used when he felt cornered. The one that usually preceded him telling her she was being unreasonable. You cannot just... I can, she said. I have. I want you to know this not because I want to hurt you, but because you're going to make decisions in the next 24 hours, and I'd rather you make them with accurate information than with whatever story you've been telling yourself. This is insane. He leaned forward, lowering his voice, and she could see the anger now, right underneath the surface. You're sitting here acting like you own everything. I do own most of it, she said. That's the part I think you may have stopped thinking about clearly. He stared at her. She reached into her clutch and set the watch box on the table between them. She didn't open it, didn't explain it. She just left it there. I had that engraved this afternoon, she said. Before I came here, I thought we were celebrating. Ethan looked at the box. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something and only now understanding how far down it went. Olivia, listen to me. I'm going to finish my wine and go home, she said. We don't need to do this tonight. We don't need to do it loudly or in front of anyone. But I want you to know. She stopped, considered how to say the next part. I'm not angry, I'm just done, and there's a difference. She heard footsteps behind her, light heels on marble flooring. Vanessa Hale stopped a few feet from the table. She was attractive in the way that required significant effort and significant money, structured in the right places, highlighted at the right angles. She looked at Olivia the way people look at something they hadn't expected to find in a room and weren't sure yet how to categorize. I'm sorry, Vanessa said, not sounding particularly sorry. I didn't realize. I'm Olivia Caldwell, Olivia said, turning to look at her. Ethan's wife. She said it without heat, without performance, just a statement of fact. I was just leaving. She stood, picked up her clutch, and smoothed her coat. Please sit down. Your food will get cold. She set one hand briefly on the back of Ethan's chair as she passed, not his shoulder, just the chair, and walked across the dining room toward the entrance at a pace that suggested she had somewhere more important to be. The hostess thanked her on the way out. Olivia said goodnight. Dead. The car was waiting on the street. Not a hired car, not an Uber, but the town car she kept on retainer through her own accounts. The one Ethan had never bothered to learn the number for because he had always assumed it was just there for both of them. The driver, a quietly efficient man named Paul, who had been driving for her family since she was in her 20s, opened the door without being asked. Home, Mrs. Caldwell? Yes, she said. Then, after she'd settled into the seat and the door had closed. Actually, Paul, can you give me a few minutes before we go? Of course. She sat in the back of the car with the city moving around it, the headlights, the horns, the particular noise of Manhattan on a Thursday night, and she allowed herself exactly what she had been keeping in check inside the restaurant. Not tears, still not that. More like the weight of the thing. 11 years. She had married Ethan at 31, when the Sterling family money was something she carried quietly, almost apologetically, the way wealthy women are sometimes taught to carry it. Not flaunting, not weaponizing, just providing. Just making things easier, just ensuring that the life they built together had a foundation that wouldn't crack under pressure. She had never imagined she was the only one doing the building. She took out her phone and looked at the call log. Margaret had already sent a confirmation text. Protocol initiated. CPA and asset team notified. We'll update you by 6 a.m. Olivia typed back, thank you. Then she looked out the window at the restaurant entrance, where she half expected to see Ethan come rushing out. He didn't. Of course he didn't. He was still sitting in there, she imagined, working through the math, trying to figure out what exactly had just happened to his life and whether there was a version of the next 24 hours in which it didn't fall apart completely. The truth was, she had thought about this. Not recently, not in the last weeks or months, but years ago, early in the marriage, when she had asked her father's estate attorney to explain clearly what would happen to the trust assets in the event of a divorce. She had done it quietly, and she had never told Ethan. Not because she had expected to need it, just because she was someone who believed in knowing where the exits were before you needed them. Her father had taught her that. Harrison Sterling had not been a warm man exactly, but he had been a precise one, and he had taught his daughter that the most important thing about inherited wealth was not spending it or growing it or showing it. It was understanding it completely, every instrument and mechanism and legal structure, so that no one could ever pick it up and use it against you. She had thought she was protecting herself from strangers. It had not occurred to her that she was protecting herself from Ethan. She sat with that for a moment, the way you have to sit with certain things before you can file them away and keep moving. Then she said, "Okay, Paul, we can go." The Fifth Avenue apartment was 23 floors up, with a view of the park that Ethan had loved to show people. The kind of view that functioned as an accessory, something you wore at dinner parties, to announce a particular kind of life. He had moved in 3 months after they married. His previous apartment, a decent but modest two-bedroom in Murray Hill, had been given up without ceremony, and he had settled into the Sterling apartment with the ease of a man who had been waiting for exactly this kind of space without realizing he was waiting. Olivia walked through it now the way she always walked through rooms when she needed to think. Slowly, without turning on too many lights, touching things not to move them, but just to feel their solidity. The kitchen, the den. The long corridor lined with photographs, some of which included Ethan and some of which she now noticed, really noticed, for the first time, did not. She stopped in front of one from their first anniversary. They were at a restaurant in Florence, the one with the terrace over the Arno, and Ethan had his arm around her and was squinting slightly into the sun, and she was laughing at something she couldn't remember anymore. She looked happy in the photograph. She probably was happy. That was the part that didn't make it simpler, so the fact that there had been real years, real mornings, real small kindnesses mixed in with all the rest of it. But she had also learned from watching her father negotiate with men who had wronged him that the existence of good years did not obligate you to tolerate the betrayal that ended them. She went to the kitchen and made tea, the ordinary kind, nothing ceremonial, the bag still in the cup because she never remembered to take it out, and she sat at the kitchen island and opened her laptop. She had work to do. Not revenge, not yet, not ever. That wasn't the frame she was operating in, but there was a great deal of documentation she needed to organize, a great deal of financial history she needed to make available to Margaret's team, and the quiet hours of a Thursday night in an apartment that was still technically hers were as good a time as any to begin. She opened the Sterling Trust files. She opened the corporate lending records. She opened the folder she had labeled 2 years ago in a moment of wry private humor, architecture, meaning the architecture of how everything was built, who had built it, what was load-bearing and what was decorative. She worked until almost midnight. Then she closed the laptop, rinsed her cup, and went to bed in the guest room, not out of drama, not because she was avoiding the primary bedroom, but because she genuinely slept better in the guest room, had for years, and there was no longer any reason to pretend otherwise. She lay in the dark and listened to the city outside the window. A siren somewhere. A cab horn. The particular low sound of Manhattan that never fully stops. She thought, I am going to be all right. Not as a comfort, not as a prayer or a hope or a reassurance she needed to offer herself to get through the night. Just as an observation, a thing she knew the way she knew the difference between an asset and a liability, the way she knew the sound of her father's voice when he was reading a contract rather than performing one. She thought, I'm going to be all right. And then she went to sleep. The call came at 6:14 in the morning, which meant Margaret had been working through the night. Olivia was already awake. She had been awake since 5, sitting in the kitchen with the second cup of tea she'd made and abandoned, watching the park through the window turn from black to gray to the particular pale gold that Manhattan mornings sometimes produced in October when the weather hadn't yet decided to be cold. She picked up on the first ring. It's messier than we expected, Margaret said, and Olivia could hear the particular flatness in her voice that meant she had found something she hadn't wanted to find. The corporate lending structure, the facility tied to the Sterling Trust that was extended to Caldwell Strategic in 2019, it wasn't a clean line of credit. Your father's estate attorney set it up as a convertible instrument, meaning at some point in the negotiation, someone, and I want to be careful here because I'm still pulling documentation, someone agreed to terms that could give Ethan's firm a basis to argue partial ownership interest in the trust vehicle. Olivia set down her tea. Explain that to me plainly, she said. It means Ethan may have grounds to claim that the 2019 facility wasn't a loan. It may have been structured as equity participation, which means his attorneys could argue he's not a debtor. He's a stakeholder. The park outside the window was very quiet. A single jogger moved along one of the paths below, rhythmic and oblivious. Who would have agreed to that on our side? Olivia asked. That's what I'm trying to establish. The document has 2 signatures. One is the estate attorney, Gerald Mack, who retired in 2021. The other is a pause. It appears to be your husband's signature on behalf of a family holding entity called Caldwell Heritage Group. I know what Caldwell Heritage Group is, Olivia said. It's his parents' company, the one that was in trouble before we married. Right, And that's where this gets complicated, because the 2019 facility wasn't the first time these two entities intersected. There's a 2012 agreement, which would have been the year before your wedding, that I think you need to look at. Olivia was quiet for a moment. Send me everything. Already in your inbox. Olivia, Margaret hesitated, which was not something she did often. I want to make sure you're prepared for the possibility that this is going to be more complicated than a straightforward asset separation. If Ethan's attorneys are good, and they will be, because he'll hire good ones the moment he understands what's at stake, this could get loud. Let it get loud, Olivia said. I know what I own. She hung up, opened her email, and started reading. By 8 o'clock, she had read enough to understand the shape of it. By 9, she had called her financial advisor, a dry, meticulous man named Philip Sayer, who had managed the Sterling family's investment structures for over a decade and who received the news of Olivia's impending divorce with the same expression he received all news: a slight adjustment around the eyes, a short nod, and then an immediate pivot to the practical. The 2012 agreement, he said, when she walked him through it in his midtown office, which smelled like old paper and cold coffee and had not been redecorated since approximately 2003. I was not involved in that. I know, Olivia said. That's what concerns me. Do you know who was? I think it was my father and Ethan's father, before either of us had any real involvement in the trust. She set the document on Philip's desk and pointed to the date. This was 18 months before the wedding. Philip looked at it for a long time without touching it. This looks like a rescue package, he said finally. Caldwell Heritage Group was in significant trouble in 2011. I recall hearing about it. They had exposure to a commercial real estate collapse in New Jersey, and they didn't have the liquidity to cover it. How bad was it? Bad enough that without outside capital, the company probably would have failed within 18 months. He looked up at her. Your father provided that capital. Olivia absorbed this. She looked at the wall behind Philip's desk, which had a framed photograph of a mountain she'd never been able to identify. And she thought about her father, Harrison Sterling, who had been dead for 4 years and who had never in all those years mentioned any of this. So the marriage, she said, was it? I don't know, Philip said. I genuinely don't know what was agreed to between those two men, but I think you need to find out before Ethan's attorneys find a way to use it. She took the document back, folded it precisely along its original crease, and put it in her bag. Get me everything you have on the 2012 capital flow into Caldwell Heritage, she said. Everything. By end of day. She stood up and put on her coat. Philip, does any of this change what I own? He looked at her over the top of his glasses. No, he said, but it may change how hard someone fights you for it. Dad, Ethan called at 10:37. She watched the phone buzz on the seat of the car next to her and let it go to voicemail. He called again at 10:41. This time, she picked up. We need to talk, he said. He sounded like he hadn't slept, which he probably hadn't. We are talking, she said, in person. Olivia, you can't just... She heard him stop himself, recalibrate. The anger was there, but he was trying to manage it, which meant he'd already spoken to someone, probably his business partner, Davis Chen, who was considerably smarter than Ethan about managing his own impulses. Can we meet? Somewhere private. Not the apartment. The apartment is still my apartment, she said. But fine. The lobby of the Carlyle, 12:30. I have a meeting at 2. A pause. The Carlyle. Yes. Fine. She could tell he had wanted to suggest somewhere he controlled, his office or a conference room he could populate with allies. And the Carlyle was neutral enough that he couldn't object without sounding petty. She had chosen it partly for that reason and partly because she knew the bar well and trusted the discretion of its staff, which mattered because whatever Ethan was about to say to her, she preferred to hear it somewhere that wasn't going to repeat it to page 6 by afternoon. Bob. He was already there when she arrived, sitting in one of the leather chairs near the window, his jacket slightly rumpled, looking like a man who had spent the morning reassembling himself and not quite gotten there. He stood when he saw her, which struck her as an oddly formal gesture given everything. Thank you for coming, he said. She sat down across from him without responding to that. A server appeared and she ordered coffee. Ethan said he was fine, then changed his mind and asked for water. "I want to explain," he said once they were alone. "You don't need to," she said. "I'm not here for an explanation." "Then what are you here for?" "I want to know about the 2012 agreement," she said, "between your father and mine." The shift in his face was subtle but real. A small tightening, a recalibration. He hadn't expected that. He had come ready to talk about Vanessa, about the affair, about whatever version of the story he had prepared, and she had stepped completely around all of it and landed on the thing he'd been hoping she wouldn't find for at least a few more days. "Where did you—" He stopped. "Olivia, that was before we were married. It had nothing to do with—" "It was a rescue package for your family's company," she said. "My father's capital saved Caldwell Heritage from insolvency. A year and a half before our wedding." She kept her voice low and steady. The couple at the next table was absorbed in their own conversation. "I want to know what was discussed between our fathers in exchange for that." "Nothing was discussed," he said. "It was a business arrangement. A business arrangement between two men whose children then got married 12 months later." "That's a coincidence." She looked at him. "Ethan." He looked away. He looked out the window at Madison Avenue, at the traffic, at the neutral middle distance that people look at when they're trying to decide how much of a thing to admit. "My father needed help," he said. "Your father offered it. That's all I know. I was 28. I wasn't in the room." "Were you told about it before the wedding?" A long silence. "Ethan, were you told about it before the wedding?" "My father mentioned there had been an arrangement," he said finally, still not looking at her. He didn't go into detail. He said the Sterling family had been helpful, and that it was important to him that the relationship— He stopped, started again, and this time she could hear something that might have been genuine discomfort, not performed. "He said it would be good for both families." Olivia sat with that for a moment. The coffee arrived. She wrapped her hands around the cup. "Did you love me?" she asked. "In the beginning. I'm not asking to hurt you. I just want to know if it was real." He turned back from the window and looked at her, and she was surprised to find that he looked, not broken exactly, but cracked, like something had given way behind his face. "Yes," he said. "It was real." He rubbed his hand across his forehead. "It got complicated. I don't know, something happened to me somewhere in the middle of it, and I couldn't—" He shook his head. "I couldn't stand feeling like I owed everything to your family, to your money. Every deal I closed, every press mention, every time someone said my name in a room, I kept thinking, would this exist without the Sterling connection? Would any of this be real without what your father did for mine?" "So you had an affair," Olivia said, "because you felt inadequate." "That sounds worse than—" "It sounds like what it was," she said, not unkindly. "I'm not judging you. I'm just naming it accurately." He was quiet. "Vanessa," he said, and then seemed to lose the thread of whatever he had intended to say about her. "It wasn't— I'm not in love with her. I don't know if that makes it better or worse." "It doesn't make it either," Olivia said. "It just makes it true." She drank her coffee. Outside, a bus went by and the light shifted the way it does in October, gold and moving, and for a moment the bar felt suspended from everything around it. Just two people in chairs across from each other with 11 years of complicated history laid out between them like a set of documents neither of them particularly wanted to sign. "I want a clean separation," she said. "I am not interested in a fight, but I need you to be honest with your attorneys about the 2019 facility, because if they try to argue equity participation and it goes to court, everything becomes public, and I don't think that serves either of us." "I know what the 2019 facility was," he said. "It was a loan. My CFO made it look like a credit line, but it was always a loan." He said it with the weariness of someone putting down something they'd been carrying too long. "I'll tell my attorneys that." She nodded. "Olivia." He leaned forward slightly. "The apartment is mine," she said. "We both know that." He sat back. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." She finished her coffee and set the cup down. She looked at her watch, not the engraved one, she had left that in its box at home. She wasn't sure yet what to do with it. and noted that she had 50 minutes before her next meeting. "There's going to be press," she said. "There already may be. Someone in that restaurant last night knew who we were." "I know. I'm not going to manage your narrative for you, but I'd appreciate it if you didn't do anything in the next week that makes this louder than it needs to be." He looked at her with something she hadn't seen on his face in years. Not love, not anger, not even guilt exactly, but a kind of recognition. Like he was finally seeing her clearly, and the clarity was painful in a way he hadn't expected. "Okay," he said. She put on her coat, picked up her bag, and stood. "Take care of yourself," she said, and meant it, and left. The press piece ran 2 days later. It was not in a newspaper. It was in one of those digital publications that occupied the specific niche between gossip blog and social journalism, the kind that had enough of a readership among the city's professional class to be treated as almost credible. The headline was careful, but the framing was not. Sources close to the Caldwell-Sterling split say heiress used financial control to dominate marriage. There was a photograph of Olivia from a charity event 2 years ago. She was in profile, her expression unreadable in the way that photographs sometimes make composed people look cold, and one of Ethan and Vanessa at what appeared to be a restaurant opening, smiling, relaxed, Vanessa's hand on his arm. Olivia read it twice, which was once more than she needed to in order to understand what had happened. Someone had fed this to them. The framing was too specific, too practiced. Financial control, loveless arrangement, sources close to Ethan Caldwell describe a marriage defined by inequality of power. This was not a journalist piecing together a story from restaurant witnesses. This was a narrative that had been prepared, packaged, and delivered. She called Margaret. "I saw it," Margaret said before Olivia could speak. "Who would have done this?" "My first guess is a PR firm working on Ethan's behalf, possibly without his direct knowledge. Davis Chen has contacts in that world, and he's protective of the brand they've built." Margaret paused. "It could also be Vanessa. She has more of a public profile than people realize. She's done this kind of thing before, shaping her own story in advance of someone else shaping it for her." "What do I do?" "Nothing," Margaret said. "Not yet. Any response you give right now becomes part of the story. You're a controlling billionaire who froze her husband's accounts. That's the frame they've set. If you push back immediately, you're playing defense in their game. Let it sit for 48 hours. Let them feel like it worked." Olivia hated that advice. She said, "Fine." "In the meantime," Margaret said, "I want you to talk to someone, a communications attorney named Dina Park. She's the best in the city at this kind of thing, and she doesn't talk to press ever, which matters because your regular PR people might be tempted to. Set it up." She put the phone down and looked at the article again. The photograph of herself, that composed, unreadable profile, and she thought about how strange it was to see herself described and to recognize almost nothing of the description. A controlling woman, a cold billionaire, a wife who had used money as a weapon. She thought about the restaurant. She thought about the fact that she had sat down, ordered a glass of wine, and made one phone call to her attorney. She thought about the watch in the box on the kitchen counter, the engraved face, the ribbon she still hadn't untied. She closed the article. She opened her laptop and went back to the financial documents. She had a great deal of work to do, and allowing a press narrative to derail her focus was not something she was willing to give Ethan, or Vanessa, or Davis Chen, or whoever had made that call to that publication, the satisfaction of achieving. The city, however, had its own momentum. By Thursday, the story had been picked up and restated by 2 other outlets, each one adding a slightly different detail, each one sharpening the image of Olivia as the villain of the piece. One ran a quote from an anonymous source, described as a longtime acquaintance of the couple, who said that Ethan had always seemed slightly diminished in his wife's presence. Another found a photograph of Olivia at a board meeting for the Sterling Family Foundation, seated at the head of the table, and ran it under the caption, "The Woman Who Controlled the Purse Strings." Her phone was busy in a way it hadn't been since her father died. People called to express support in the particular way that New York people express support, carefully, warmly, while also establishing that they were aware of the situation and therefore relevant to it. Her college roommate, Sophie Carraway, called, and did not do any of that, which is why Olivia actually picked up. "How bad is it?" Sophie asked. "It's managed," Olivia said. "I have good people." "That's not what I asked." Olivia was quiet for a moment. She was in the guest room, sitting on the edge of the bed, her shoes still on from a meeting she'd come home from an hour ago and hadn't had the energy to fully remove herself from. "It's bad enough," she admitted. "They've gotten ahead of the story." "The Vanessa piece is insulting," Sophie said. "The woman has spent 3 years positioning herself as—" "I know what she's done," Olivia said. "Are you eating?" "Sophie, I'm asking because I know you, and when you're in management mode, you forget that you're also a person." "I ate," Olivia said, which was mostly true. She had eaten half of something around noon and had not thought about food since. "I'm fine." "You are not fine. You found your husband with someone else 3 days ago, and now you're being painted as the villain of a story you didn't write." Sophie's voice was even, but not gentle, which was what Olivia needed more than gentle. "You're allowed to not be fine." "I know." "Are you sleeping?" "Better than I expected," Olivia said, which was true. The guest room was quiet, the bed was good, and she found that exhaustion had a way of settling the mind when the mind had already made its decision. There was nothing left to agonize about in the dark. The decision had been made. What remained was execution. "Do you want company?" Sophie asked. "Not yet," Olivia said. "Maybe next week." "Okay, I'm here. Call me when it's not about logistics." She hung up and sat a moment longer on the edge of the bed. The apartment was very quiet. It was the kind of quiet that happens in a large apartment when it has always, for years, been lived in by 2 people and suddenly isn't. Not unbearable. Not even particularly sad. Just noticeable. The way the weight distribution of a room changes when something large is removed from it. She took off her shoes. She ordered dinner. She ate it at the kitchen island with a glass of wine and a legal brief Margaret had sent over, and the city outside the window did what it always did, which was continue without her permission and without her participation, indifferent and luminous and entirely occupied with itself. Dina Park was nothing like what Olivia had expected. She had expected someone polished and strategic and visibly expensive, the kind of person whose entire manner communicated that they had seen this before and were not particularly impressed by it. What she got was a compact woman in her early 50s in a blazer that needed ironing, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once in her professional life needed to perform authority because she actually had it. "Here's the thing about what they've done," Dina said, settling into the chair across from Olivia in Margaret's conference room, not bothering with small talk. "They moved fast because they were scared. The speed of this narrative is a tell. They didn't have time to be subtle because they knew you'd taken steps they weren't prepared for." She set a printed copy of the initial article on the table and tapped it twice. "This framing, controlling billionaire loveless marriage, this is defensive positioning. They're trying to make you look like the aggressor before you've done anything publicly." "I haven't done anything publicly," Olivia said. "I know, which is why their version is currently the only one." Dina leaned back. "We're not going to respond directly. We're not going to issue statements. What we're going to do is make sure that when you do appear publicly, you appear as you actually are, and the contrast between that and what they've described does the work for you." "What does that mean, practically?" "It means there's a board meeting for the Sterling Family Foundation next month. You chair it. You appear, you participate, the people in that room see who you are. And some of them talk to the press because that's what people do." She looked at her glasses chain. "It also means the charity gala in December, the one your family has hosted for 20 years. You attend. You don't avoid it. You don't modify it. You don't give any indication that any of this has changed who you are or what you do." "Ethan will be at that gala," Olivia said. "I know." Dina looked at her steadily. "Is that a problem?" Olivia thought about it honestly, which was what the question deserved. "No," she said. "Good." Dina picked up her notepad and wrote something. "In the meantime, I need you to be invisible in the right ways and visible in the wrong ones for them. No social media. I assume that's already your position. I'm barely on it. Keep it that way. No comments to journalists, not even friendly ones, not even off the record. Especially not off the record. And if Vanessa Hale posts anything about her life in the next several weeks that implies a level of financial stability she no longer has access to, document it. Don't respond to it. Document it. Olivia nodded. One more thing, Dina said. She set her pen down and looked at Olivia with the directness of a woman who had been paid enough to skip the soft edges. I've seen a lot of situations like this. Women in your position who got defined by someone else's version of events before they had a chance to write their own. The ones who came out of it intact were not the ones who fought hardest or moved fastest. They were the ones who were most consistently, recognizably themselves. She paused. Can you do that? Olivia held her gaze. That's the one thing I've always been able to do. Dina almost smiled. Then we'll be fine. What she had not told Dina, what she had not told anyone except Margaret, and Margaret only in the most legal and structural of terms, was what she had found in the second set of documents Philip sent over. The capital flow records from 2012, the ones detailing exactly how her father's money had moved into Caldwell Heritage Group, included a memorandum that had been drafted but apparently never formally executed, a side letter between Harrison Sterling and Ethan's father, Douglas Caldwell, outlining the terms of what Harrison had described, in his precise and slightly archaic legal vocabulary, as the familial alignment. It was not a marriage contract. It was nothing so explicit or legally binding as that. But it was a document that made clear that Harrison Sterling had understood, when he provided capital to save Douglas Caldwell's failing company, that the relationship between his daughter and Douglas's son was considered by both men a component of the arrangement, not a requirement, not a stated condition, but a component, something both parties acknowledged and in which both parties had an interest. Olivia had read that memorandum 3 times. She had put it away. She had taken it out again and read it a 4th time. She was not angry at her father. She was something more complicated than angry, something that lived in the territory between grief and understanding, between the love she still carried for a man who was dead and the recognition of what that man had done and what he had perhaps imagined he was doing for her, and how profoundly wrong that imagination had been. She did not know, and might never know, whether Ethan had genuinely fallen in love with her, or whether whatever he had felt had always been tangled up in obligation and resentment and the debt he'd never been able to name. She thought about what he'd said at the Carlisle. I couldn't stand feeling like I owed everything to your family. And she thought about how it was possible to love someone and also to resent the circumstances of loving them, and how that resentment, left to itself in the dark, could eat through a marriage the way water eats through stone. Slowly, without announcement, until one day the structure simply gives. She did not forgive him. She did not yet know if she would, and she wasn't going to manufacture the feeling because it seemed like something she was supposed to produce. But she understood, in a way she hadn't 24 hours earlier, that there was more than one person in this story who had not been entirely honest about the foundations they were building on. She put the memorandum in the legal file. She poured a glass of water. She stood at the kitchen window and watched the park, and thought about what it meant to know the truth about something and still not know what to do with it. She thought, her father had believed he was taking care of her. He had been wrong about what that meant, but the intention had been, in its flawed and controlling way, love. She thought, that didn't change anything she had decided, but it changed how she understood what she was navigating. She turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. The documents arrived on a Tuesday, which felt wrong for the kind of news they contained. Tuesday being an ordinary, midweek sort of day with no particular weight to it, the kind of day on which nothing important was supposed to happen. Philip Sayers' associate, a young woman named Claire who communicated exclusively by email and never used more words than necessary, sent a single message at 11:47 in the morning. Additional records located in the Caldwell Heritage filing, flagged for your attention, forwarding to Miss Chu as well. Olivia was in a cab on the way to a lunch she had already decided she didn't want to attend when the notification came through. She opened the attachment, read 3 paragraphs, and told the driver to take her back to the apartment instead. What Philip's team had found was not, technically, new information. It was old information, very old, the kind that had been sitting in a filing cabinet in a storage facility in White Plains for 12 years, misfiled under a subsidiary name that no longer existed, which was either a remarkable administrative accident or something that had been arranged to look like one. What it contained was a series of internal communications between Douglas Caldwell and the attorney who had structured the 2012 rescue package, Gerald Mack, the same estate attorney who had retired in 2021 and whose signature appeared on the convertible instrument Margaret had flagged in the first days of the separation. The emails were mundane in their language and devastating in their content. Douglas Caldwell had not merely received capital from Harrison Sterling in 2012. He had, according to the internal correspondence, actively solicited it, had approached Harrison through a mutual acquaintance in the spring of 2011, at the point when Caldwell Heritage's commercial real estate exposure had become impossible to conceal from its creditors, and had framed the conversation not as a business negotiation, but as a personal one. The emails between Douglas and Mack discussed, in the careful and slightly euphemistic language of men who understood that what they were doing was better not said plainly, the value of formalized family connection as a mechanism for securing long-term trust between the two entities. One email, dated August 2011, used the phrase the children's relationship as a stabilizing factor. Another, from October of that year, referred to the expected timeline of personal developments in a way that made clear both men understood exactly what was being discussed. By the time Harrison Sterling had agreed to provide the capital, Ethan and Olivia had been dating for 4 months. She read all of it standing in the elevator of her building, her coat still on, her bag still on her shoulder. She read it again in the apartment, at the kitchen island, more slowly this time, with the particular attention she gave to documents that required her to set aside her immediate reaction and understand precisely what she was looking at before she allowed herself to feel it. What she was looking at was this. The relationship between Ethan Caldwell and Olivia Sterling had been, from very near its beginning, observed and tended by two men who had a financial interest in its outcome. Not arranged, she was clear-eyed enough about the distinction to hold on to it. Ethan had not been instructed to pursue her, but he had been encouraged, in the oblique and pressured way that fathers encourage sons, when family survival is at stake. And the encouragement had come with the specific knowledge that Harrison Sterling would be more inclined to help if the families were personally connected. She thought about the beginning. She thought about meeting Ethan at a gallery opening on a Thursday evening in February, how he had been funny and direct, and not at all the way she had expected a man who ran in his circles to be. She thought about the first 3 months, which had been genuinely good, the kind of good that felt like discovery. She had believed that. She still believed it, in the sense that she believed her own experience of it. But she now understood that the conditions under which that beginning had occurred were not what she had thought they were. She sat with that for a long time, long enough for the light in the kitchen to shift from morning to afternoon. Then she called Margaret. "I've read it," Margaret said, picking up immediately, which meant she had been waiting. "What's your read on the liability?" From a legal standpoint, it doesn't change the asset structure significantly. The rescue package was still a financial instrument, not a formal contract of personal obligation. No court is going to look at those emails and conclude that your marriage was a transaction. Margaret paused. But from an evidentiary standpoint, if Ethan's attorneys try to claim that the 2019 facility represented equity participation, try to argue he was a partner, not a debtor, these documents complicate that argument significantly, because they establish that the original 2012 arrangement was predicated on a relationship of dependency, not partnership. His family needed your family's money. That's the documented reality. So it helps us. It helps us. But Olivia, it also means that if this becomes public, the story changes. Right now they're running a narrative about a cold billionaire who controlled her husband. If those emails come out, the story becomes something different. It becomes about two fathers who made a private arrangement and what that did to their children. Olivia was quiet. "That's a story with more sympathy for you," Margaret said carefully. "But it's also a story that involves your father, who is not here to explain himself, and that makes it complicated." "I know," Olivia said. "Do you want to use them?" She thought about her father. She thought about his study, which had smelled like leather and old books, and the particular wool of the sweaters he always wore in winter. She thought about the way he had talked about money, not as a subject, but as a language, something you learned and then used to say things that couldn't be said otherwise. She thought about whether he had believed he was doing something good for her when he had sat across from Douglas Caldwell and discussed the expected timeline of personal developments. She thought he probably had believed that. She thought he had been a man who loved her in his precise and controlling way, and who had genuinely not understood the difference between protecting someone and deciding their life for them. "Not yet," she said. "Keep them in reserve." She did not tell Ethan she had found them, not immediately. What she did instead was call Douglas Caldwell. She had his number. They had maintained the cordial, slightly careful relationship that in-laws sometimes have when they both understand that the marriage connecting them requires a certain amount of managed distance. Douglas was 71 now, retired, living in a house in Connecticut that Caldwell Heritage had purchased before the company had been fully liquidated following the 2016 restructuring. He answered on the third ring and sounded for a moment genuinely glad to hear from her, which made what came next harder. "Douglas," she said, "I need to talk to you about 2012. The silence that followed was brief but complete. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Not dramatically, not guiltily, but in the way that older men sometimes change when they understand that a reckoning has arrived and have long since stopped being surprised that reckonings arrive. "I wondered," he said, "when you'd find those. Did you know I'd find them eventually?" "I thought it was likely." He exhaled, a long sound. Gerald kept everything. It was one of his professional virtues, and in this case, his professional failure. "Were you going to tell me?" "I thought about it many times." A pause. "I told myself it didn't matter because the marriage was real. Whatever the circumstances, what Ethan felt was real. And what my father felt he was entitled to do with my life." The silence this time was longer. "Your father was trying to protect you," Douglas said. "I know how that sounds. I know that's not—" "He was trying to protect the trust," she said. "He was trying to protect the assets. A son-in-law who owed him the survival of his family business was a son-in-law who wouldn't be a threat to those assets. That's what he was doing." Douglas didn't argue. She gave him credit for that. "Did Ethan know?" she asked. "Before we married, did he know specifically, not just that there had been an arrangement, as he told me, but what the arrangement actually involved?" Another long pause. This one felt different, heavier, more reluctant. "His mother told him," Douglas said finally. "When they got engaged, she felt he should know the full picture." He stopped. "I was against it. I thought, you thought it was better to keep it from him." "I thought it would complicate something that had become genuine," he said, and she heard in his voice the specific tone of a man who had been wrong about something important and had lived with that knowledge for a decade. "I was wrong about a great many things." She sat with the phone against her ear and looked at the window, at the park, at the October sky which had gone flat and gray in the way it did before rain. "Thank you for being honest with me," she said. "Olivia." His voice had something in it now. Not a request, not quite a plea. "Whatever happens between you and Ethan, I want you to know that I always thought you were extraordinary. That wasn't the arrangement. That was just what was true." She thanked him again and ended the call. She sat in the apartment for 20 minutes without doing anything. Then she put on her coat, took the elevator down, and walked into the park because she needed to move. Needed the particular clarity that came from cold air and pavement and the city around her doing its continuous, indifferent thing. She called Ethan that evening. Not to tell him what she'd found. Not yet. She called because after speaking to his father, she understood that Ethan had known, on the day he married her, more than he had admitted at the Carlisle, and she wanted to hear what he did with a direct question. "Did your mother tell you about the 2012 agreement?" she asked. "Before the wedding, did she tell you what it actually involved?" The silence on his end was not the silence of a man surprised by the question. It was the silence of a man who had been carrying something for a long time and had just felt the weight of it shift. "Yes," he said. "When?" 3 weeks before the wedding." His voice was low, careful. "She sat me down and told me the whole thing, what my father had done, what the deal involved, what Harrison Sterling had apparently expected in return. "And you married me anyway." "I loved you," he said, "and I hated myself for the circumstances, and I thought if I made the marriage real enough, if I built something genuinely successful, it would stop mattering where it came from." He stopped. "It didn't stop mattering." "No," she said. "It ate you alive." He didn't answer that. She hadn't expected him to. "You should have told me," she said, "before the wedding. Whatever else was true, that was mine to know." "I know that. I would have wanted to make that choice with accurate information." "I know," he said again. "I told myself you would have called it off, that I was protecting the relationship, but I think—" He stopped again. She waited. "I think I was protecting myself from finding out if you would have chosen me anyway." She thought about the woman she had been at 31. She thought about whether, if someone had sat her down 3 weeks before her wedding and explained the full architecture of what had been arranged between her father and her fiancé's father, she would have walked away. She honestly didn't know. And the not knowing was its own particular kind of loss, not of the marriage itself, but of the version of herself who might have made a real choice about it. "I have to go," she said. "My attorneys will be in touch about the settlement documents." "Olivia." "Ethan." Her voice was even. "I don't have anything left to say tonight." She hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment with the phone in her hand. Then she poured a glass of water and drank it and went to find something to eat because Margaret had sent another set of documents that required her attention by morning, and she had work to do. Botsy. She met with Ethan's attorneys 9 days later in a conference room at Margaret's firm. They were exactly what she had expected: sharp, expensive, working the angles, and for the first 40 minutes they performed the particular theater of legal negotiation that is designed to make the other side feel that cooperation is generosity. They circled the 2019 facility. They tested the edges of the convertible instrument argument without committing to it, watching to see how Margaret responded, looking for the place where Olivia's position might have a soft center. It didn't. Margaret had prepared the counter-documentation with the thoroughness of someone who had been doing this for 25 years and had very little patience for men who confused posturing with leverage. She laid out the asset structure, the trust instruments, the corporate lending records, the full and factual history of what the Sterling Capital had built and what it had not. She was polite. She was entirely without warmth. The lead attorney, a man named Gerald Foss, who wore his authority in his shoulders, leaned forward at one point and said, "Ms. Sterling has benefited significantly from Mr. Caldwell's business relationships and his public profile during the course of this marriage. We'd argue that the Sterling Trust's returns over the last decade reflect in part the value he brought." "We'd argue the opposite," Margaret said, "and we'd have considerably more documentation to support it." Foss smiled the way people smile when they're deciding whether to escalate. "There's also the matter of certain personal correspondence. If you're referring to the 2011 communications between Douglas Caldwell and Gerald Mack," Margaret said, "we have those." The room shifted. It was a small shift, the kind most people might not have noticed. A slight adjustment in how Gerald Foss was sitting, a quick exchange of glances between him and his junior associate. Olivia noticed. She had been watching for it. "We're not interested in making those public," Margaret continued. "We're not interested in making anything public. What we're interested in is a clean, complete, and final separation of every financial instrument connecting Mr. Caldwell to the Sterling Trust, and a written acknowledgement that the 2019 facility was a debt, not an equity instrument. In exchange for those things, we will proceed without litigation." Foss looked at Olivia directly for the first time in the meeting. She met his eyes and said nothing, which was the appropriate thing, and he seemed to understand that. The meeting ended 90 minutes later without resolution, but with the clear sense that resolution was closer than it had been before they walked in. Margaret called it a productive first session. Olivia called it the beginning of the end of something. The first indication that the public narrative was beginning to turn came from an unlikely source, a journalist named Patricia Holt, who wrote a column in a financial publication that Olivia had been reading since her 20s, reached out to Dina Park with a request for a brief background conversation. Nothing on the record, No quotes attributed. Dina had said she would pass it along. She's not writing about the divorce, Dina explained. She's writing about the broader pattern of how women with inherited wealth get characterized in the press when marriages end. She's interviewed 7 other women in the last month. Your name came up in the context of the initial coverage, but she's not writing about you specifically. What does she want to know? How the framing works, who benefits from it. She's asking background sources whether the controlling billionaire narrative has a template. Dina looked at Olivia over her ironing-challenged blazer. She's a fair journalist. She's not going to write a hit piece in either direction. But if you were willing to speak with her background, not to set a record straight, just to provide context about how these narratives get built, I think it would be worth your time. Olivia thought about it. What do I get from it? Nothing immediate, but Patricia Holt's column is read by the people who matter in this city, and they all understand how to read between the lines of a piece like this. Dina paused. Right now the story about you is one note. A woman who freezes her husband's accounts the night she catches him at dinner is a woman who was waiting for an excuse to use power she'd been stockpiling. That's the story. Patricia's piece doesn't rewrite it, but it provides people with a framework to question it. Set it up, Olivia said. The conversation with Patricia Holt lasted 45 minutes and covered, in the careful language of background sourcing, the mechanics of how a financial narrative becomes a personal one, how legal instruments that protect assets become characterized as weapons in the press, how women who understand their own money are described as controlling, while men who depend on someone else's money are described as self-made. Olivia did not talk about Ethan. She did not talk about Vanessa. She talked about structures, financial, legal, reputational, and how they function differently depending on who was inside them. Patricia Holt listened, asked precise questions, and thanked her at the end with the specific warmth of a journalist who had gotten something genuinely useful. One off-the-record question, Patricia said as they were finishing. I may not answer it, Olivia said. Fair enough. When you called your attorney that night, at the restaurant, was it anger, or was it something else? Olivia considered the question seriously, the way it deserved. It was information, she said. I had information that changed what was true about my situation. I gave that information to someone who knew what to do with it. She paused. If my husband had called me to say the deal fell through, I wouldn't have called my attorney in grief. I would have called him to say, let's figure out what comes next. That night was the same thing, a change in conditions, a necessary response. Patricia was quiet for a moment. That's the most honest answer I've gotten from anyone in a month, she said. What happened next did not happen quickly, because real things rarely do. The settlement negotiations continued through November in the patient, grinding way of legal processes that involve significant money and significant pride on both sides. Gerald Foss tried 3 more angles on the 2019 facility and found each one blocked. He tried once, obliquely, to suggest that the existence of the 2011 correspondence represented a kind of shared culpability between the two families. And Margaret had looked at him with the expression of a woman who had heard better arguments from first-year law students and moved on without dignifying it. Ethan, as far as Olivia could tell from the secondary information that filtered through attorneys and mutual acquaintances, was not doing well. He had moved into a corporate apartment in Tribeca, the kind of furnished temporary space that people use when they are between permanent situations. And the Caldwell strategic deal with the Boston Equity Group had stalled, partly because the partner the firm had been courting had read the press coverage and decided, with the particular risk aversion of institutional money, that the situation introduced instability he wasn't comfortable with. Davis Chen had called Margaret's office twice, ostensibly about technical aspects of the corporate separation, but more plausibly to understand whether Olivia intended to take further action against the firm. Margaret had been polite and definitive. The Sterling Trust had no claims against Caldwell Strategic as an entity, only against the specific financial instruments Ethan had used personally. If the firm's deals were falling apart, that was not her client's problem. Vanessa Hale had posted, during the first 2 weeks of the public narrative, a series of photographs on her social media that tracked with remarkable consistency the life of someone who was doing extremely well. Restaurant dinners, a weekend in the Berkshires, what appeared to be a new piece of jewelry on a particular Thursday. By the third week, the restaurant dinners had become less frequent. By the fourth, the posts themselves had slowed in a way that anyone paying attention, and Olivia, on Dina's instructions, had someone paying attention, would recognize as the adjustment period when a financial arrangement changes. The Berkshire's house, it turned out, had been booked on a credit card connected to a corporate account of Ethan's. That account was one of 3 that had been frozen pending the settlement. The hotel had declined the card on checkout, and Vanessa had paid the difference herself, which was, Dina noted when she reported it, not a story they would repeat, but a data point they would file. The glamour is getting harder to maintain, Dina said, not without a small amount of satisfaction. I don't want her to suffer, Olivia said, and meant it mostly. I know you don't. Dina looked at her. But it's useful information about what the arrangement actually was, what she thought she was getting, and what it turns out she was getting. Olivia thought about Vanessa at the restaurant. The relaxed comfort of a woman who felt she belonged somewhere, the hand on Ethan's shoulder, the ease of it. She had assumed in that moment that the ease reflected genuine feeling. She was less certain of that now. She wasn't certain of the opposite either. She didn't actually know Vanessa Hale, didn't know what she had believed about the situation she had entered, and she was not interested in constructing a narrative about another woman based on incomplete information. She had seen what that looked like from the receiving end. What she knew was what she had always known, that the life Ethan had presented to the world, the deals, the apartment, the dinners, the memberships, the entire architecture of his public self, had been built on something he hadn't built, and that the person who had built it was sitting in a guest room in a Fifth Avenue apartment reading legal documents and had not yet, in any of this, received a single apology that acknowledged the full scope of what had been taken. Not the money. The money was documented and quantifiable and would be addressed in the settlement. What had been taken was harder to put in a column. The years of managing his insecurity while pretending not to notice it. The careful way she had learned to not be too capable, not too decisive, not too visibly competent in rooms where he needed to feel like the person in charge. The particular tax that capable women sometimes pay in marriages to men who cannot bear their own smallness. The shrinking, the dimming, the way you learn to take up precisely the amount of space that leaves enough room for someone else's ego to breathe. She had not known she was paying that tax until she stopped paying it. Until she sat in a restaurant and watched her husband with someone else and felt, underneath the shock and the grief and the complicated anger, something that she could only describe honestly as relief. Patricia Holt's piece ran on a Wednesday morning in late November. It was exactly what Dina had described, measured, structural, about patterns rather than individuals. It did not mention Olivia by name. It mentioned the controlling billionaire archetype 12 times, examined it from 6 different angles, and concluded with a paragraph that Olivia read 3 times because it said, in the careful language of journalism, something she had been trying to articulate to herself for weeks, that the women most likely to be labeled controlling were almost always the women who had simply stopped pretending that they didn't understand their own resources. She texted Dina, "Good piece." Dina wrote back, "Give it 48 hours." She was right. By Friday, the frame had shifted, not completely, not uniformly, but enough. 3 people at a board meeting of the Sterling Family Foundation, which Olivia chaired that week exactly as Dina had instructed, made a point of saying things to her that were not quite compliments and not quite expressions of solidarity, but existed in the space between those things, which was where social currency in this city actually moved. She was not vindicated. She did not feel vindicated. What she felt was more incremental and more real than that. The gradual return of something she had not realized she had been giving away, piece by piece, over 11 years. Her own legibility. The ability to be seen as what she actually was, rather than as whatever was useful for someone else's story. She drove home from the foundation board meeting on a Friday evening in late November, the city dark and bright at the same time the way it gets in winter, and she thought about the December gala. Still 3 weeks away, still the event Dina had marked on the calendar as the moment the public story would either crystallize or finally settle. She thought about Ethan, who would be there. She thought about what it would mean to walk into a room where everyone was watching to see who she was now, on the other side of all of this. She thought she knew. She thought she had always known. She had just spent 11 years being slightly less sure of it than she should have been, and the months ahead were going to be, among other things, the process of getting that certainty back without making it into armor, without letting what had happened to her marriage turn into bitterness that replaced one kind of narrowness with another. The driver turned onto Fifth Avenue, and the park came into view, bare-limbed and dark, lit at the edges by the glow of the buildings surrounding it. She had work still to do. The settlement was not finished. The foundation gala was not finished. The version of herself that came after all of this was not finished, was barely begun. But she was, she noticed, sitting in the back of the car with the city moving around her, no longer waiting for any of it to resolve before she allowed herself to inhabit it. She was already there. She had been there the whole time. She just hadn't had the space to notice it until now. The invitations to the Sterling Family Foundation. Annual gala had gone out in October, before any of this had happened, which meant that by December the event carried a weight it had never carried in its 22-year history. Everyone who received one knew it. Everyone who RSVP'd. Yes, did so with the particular awareness that this year the gala was not merely a charity event. It was, whether Olivia intended it to be or not, a statement. She intended it to be exactly what it had always been. That was, in itself, the statement. Dina had been clear about this from the beginning. "You don't change anything," she had said in one of their last meetings before the event. Same venue, same program, same seating structure. You chair the evening the way you've chaired it for the last 8 years. The message is in what doesn't change. "And Ethan," Olivia said, "he'll be there. He RSVP'd yes 3 weeks ago, before your attorneys had finalized the settlement framework." Dina looked at her notepad. "I assume he's bringing Vanessa." "I assume the same. Does that change anything for you?" Olivia thought about it the way she had learned to think about things in the last 2 months. Not quickly, not with the defensive speed of someone trying to protect themselves from a feeling, but deliberately, honestly, the way you look at a map before you start driving. "No," she said, "it doesn't change anything." Dina nodded once, the way she nodded when she believed what she was hearing. "Then we're ready." The week before the gala, the settlement reached what Margaret called a working framework. Not final, not signed, but structurally agreed upon on all the points that mattered. The 2019 facility was formally acknowledged as a debt instrument. Ethan's attorneys had dropped the equity participation argument cleanly, without ceremony, sometime in early December, in a manner that suggested Gerald Foss had finally done the math and understood that the 2011 correspondence made that position untenable. The Fifth Avenue apartment remained in Olivia's trust. The Hamptons house, which had been the one genuinely contested item, Ethan had spent real time there, had hosted clients there, had in some legitimate sense made it part of his professional identity, was resolved through a buyout structure that acknowledged his use of the property without conceding his ownership of it. "He'll pay it back over 7 years, Margaret explained, going through the framework in her office 2 days before the gala. "At market rate interest. It's structured as a formal debt obligation, not a settlement payment, which means it's on the record in a way that matters." "And Caldwell Strategic?" "The corporate separation is clean. The Sterling Trust has no further exposure to the firm, and the firm has no further access to Sterling-adjacent credit facilities." Margaret set down her reading glasses. "His Boston deal, by the way, has apparently been restructured with a different capital partner. Smaller terms. Davis Chen has been managing the investor relationships." "Good," Olivia said, and meant it without irony. She did not want Ethan's firm to fail. She had never wanted that. What she had wanted was accuracy. A clear account of what was hers and what wasn't, what had been built by whom and on what foundation. And the settlement, imperfect as all settlements were, was moving toward that. "There's one more thing," Margaret said, in the tone she used when there was one more thing she had been deciding how to raise. "Ethan's attorney contacted me yesterday with a personal request, not a legal one. Ethan is asking if you would be willing to speak with him briefly at the gala, privately. Not about the settlement, that's done through us. Something personal." Olivia looked at the window. Outside, the December sky was low and gray, threatening the kind of wet snow that Manhattan got in early winter that turned to slush before it was finished falling. Did he say what about? No, Gerald Foss made it clear it was not a legal matter and that it was entirely at your discretion. She thought about it. Tell them I'll consider it, she said. Tell them I'm not making any commitments about my schedule that evening. Margaret wrote something. That's exactly the right answer, she said. The gala was held at the Whitmore, a venue on the Upper East Side that the Sterling Foundation had used for 11 of the last 22 years. A converted Beaux-Arts building with high ceilings and the kind of understated grandeur that announced money without performing it, which was precisely the aesthetic Harrison Sterling had favored, and which Olivia had maintained out of a combination of genuine agreement and the specific comfort of continuity. The Foundation's work focused on financial literacy programs for women and girls, which had been her mother's original cause, and which Olivia had expanded significantly in the last decade, funding programs in 14 cities and a scholarship endowment that now supported over 300 students annually. She arrived at 6:45, 15 minutes before guests. Paul drove her, as always. She wore black as she often did for this event. Not as a statement, just because black worked in a room like the Whitmore, and she had never been interested in using her appearance as a narrative. The dress was good without being conspicuous. Her jewelry was real without being excessive. She looked like herself, which was what Dina had asked for, and what she had intended anyway. The Foundation's events director, a competent and mildly anxious woman named Rose, met her at the entrance with the evening's final run of show, and a look that communicated the particular tension of someone who had been managing other people's worry about this event for weeks, and was now very relieved to see the principal arrive looking composed. Everything's on track, Rose said. The tables are set, the AV team has done 2 run-throughs, and the kitchen confirmed the dietary adjustments for Table 7. The Brennan Foundation people at Table 7? Yes, and the honoree's family has arrived. They're in the green room. She's nervous. The honoree this year was a woman named Carmen Reyes, 53 years old, who had built a nonprofit financial counseling center in the South Bronx over the course of 12 years and had grown it from a one-room operation with 2 volunteers to a full-service organization serving over 2,000 families annually. She was nervous because she was not a person who gave speeches in rooms like the Whitmore, and Olivia had made a point of speaking with her twice in the lead-up to the event to make clear that the room would be full of people who were supposed to be impressed by her and not the other way around. Olivia went to the green room first before doing anything else. Carmen Reyes was sitting on a small sofa in her formal wear with the specific posture of someone who wasn't used to formal wear, her hands folded in her lap, her daughter beside her. She stood when Olivia came in, and Olivia shook her hand and immediately said, "Please sit down. You don't have to do that," and sat in the chair across from her. "How are you feeling?" Olivia asked. "Terrified," Carmen said, and then laughed, a short, real laugh that broke the formality of the room. "My daughter keeps telling me it's just talking, and I keep telling her I talk to people all day. This is different." "It is different," Olivia agreed. "But the thing about this room is that everyone in it has already decided to respect you before you open your mouth. The award is the verdict. The speech is just evidence." She paused. "Talk about your first client, the first family who came to you. Keep them in your head the whole time and talk to them." Carmen looked at her for a moment. "That's actually helpful," she said. "I've been doing this for 8 years, Olivia said. "Trial and error." She left the green room and moved through the venue doing what she always did in the hour before the doors opened, checking not the things Rose had already checked, but the things that Rose didn't know to check. The small calibrations of atmosphere that made the difference between an event that functioned and one that felt right. The temperature of the room. The height of the floral arrangements at the tables near the stage, which needed to be low enough that the people seated there could see the podium. The lighting on the stage itself, which a previous AV team had once set too warm, in a way that made every speaker look slightly unwell. She was doing this, standing at the edge of the stage looking at the lighting angle, when she heard someone come into the room behind her and knew, without turning around, from the specific sound of those footsteps on the Whitmore's old parquet floor, who it was. She turned. Ethan was standing at the entrance to the main room, in a dark suit, alone. He looked not good exactly. He looked like a man who had lost something and was still calculating the full extent of what it was. He had aged in the 2 months since the restaurant, not dramatically, but visibly, in the way that stress ages people when they've been pretending to be fine. "You're early," she said. It was not an accusation. It was just true. "I wanted to—" He stopped, looked at the room, the tables, the stage. "You've always made this look effortless. I never said that enough." She studied him. "What do you want to talk about, Ethan?" He came further into the room, stopping about 10 feet from her, which felt like the right distance, close enough to be a real conversation, far enough to be a careful one. "I've been trying to figure out how to say something to you for 6 weeks, he said, "and I keep ending up with lawyers and frameworks and settlement language, and none of it is the thing I actually need to say." "Then say it." He put his hands in his pockets, which was what he did when he was nervous. She had noticed that about him in the first month they'd been together, and had never stopped noticing it. "I'm sorry," he said, "not for the settlement, not for the legal specifics, for what I actually did." He looked at the floor for a moment, and then back at her. "I married you knowing things you deserve to know. I let you build a life with someone who was spending 10 years being ashamed of needing what you gave him instead of being grateful for it. And I took things. Not just money, which is documented and will be repaid, but things that aren't in any document: time, consideration. The kind of attention you give something you're trying to make work, even when it isn't." He paused. "I wasted all of it. And I'm not asking you to forgive me for that. I needed you to know that I know what I did." The room was quiet around them. Outside, she could hear the faint sound of arriving cars. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about everything she could say. The 2011 emails, the conversation with his father, the 10 years of careful management she had given to a marriage that had been built from the beginning on ground that neither of them had fully examined. She thought about the watch, still in its box at home. She thought about the Florence photograph in the hallway that she had not yet decided whether to take down. "I hear you," she said. Not "I forgive you," not "it's all right," just "I hear you." Because that was what was true. And she had decided, somewhere in the last 2 months, that she was done with saying things that were almost true as a courtesy. He nodded. He looked like a man who had expected less and wasn't sure what to do with the space she had left him. "I'm going to pay it back," he said. "The money, all of it. I know the settlement schedules it over 7 years, but I intend to do it faster." "That's between you and your accountant," she said. "I know. I just wanted to say it directly." He looked at the stage again. "The work you do here, the foundation, the scholarship programs, I never told you how much it mattered. I used to stand at events like this and think, this is Olivia's thing, not mine, and I'd feel, I don't know, peripheral, like a +1 at my own life." He shook his head slightly. "That was my failure, not yours." She waited to see if there was more. "That's it," he said. "That's all I wanted to say." "Okay," she said, and then, because it was true and she was not interested in being punishing for its own sake, "Thank you for saying it." He nodded once, started to turn, then stopped. "Is she going to be all right? Vanessa, I know things have been difficult. I know some of that is the financial situation, and some of it is—" He trailed off. Olivia looked at him steadily. "That's your responsibility," she said, "not mine." "Right," he exhaled. "Right, of course." He put his hand briefly on the back of a nearby chair. Not quite a gesture, just the need to touch something solid. "I'll find my table." "The seating chart is at the entrance," she said. "Rose can help you if you can't find it." He walked back toward the entrance, and she turned back to the stage and the lighting angle and the work of the evening, which had not stopped being her responsibility just because Ethan Caldwell had walked into the room and said the things he'd said. She adjusted the lighting herself, because she could, and because moving was better than standing still. The guests arrived in the particular way that New York money arrives at charity events, in waves, by social cluster, the rooms filling in a pattern that was less random than it appeared. Olivia moved through it all with the ease of someone who had done this many times, and who was, tonight, not performing ease, but actually feeling it, which was different and noticeable to anyone paying close enough attention. Sophie Carraway arrived at 7:15, found Olivia near the bar, and looked at her with the directness of someone who had been worried from a distance for 2 months. "You look like yourself," Sophie said. "I feel like myself," Olivia said. "Good." Sophie hugged her, briefly and without ceremony. "Where do I sit?" Table 3, next to Frank Adler from the Brennan Foundation. He's going to want to talk about the endowment restructuring. You don't have to engage. "I'll be polite and completely vague," Sophie said. "My specialty." Olivia watched her go and turned back to the room. At a table near the far wall, she could see Ethan seated with 3 people she recognized as clients of Caldwell Strategic. Not allies, exactly, not the inner circle, but the kind of professional relationships that functioned as social proof of continued relevance. He was talking, gesturing slightly, performing the version of himself that had always been his best public asset. Engaged, focused, the kind of man who made whoever he was talking to feel like the most important person in the room. Vanessa was next to him. Olivia had not seen her since the restaurant. She looked from across the room like someone who had dressed for a performance, the dress more assertive than the occasion required, the jewelry brighter than the room's understated aesthetic called for. She was talking to the woman on her left with the particular animation of someone working harder than the conversation required. Olivia looked at them for exactly as long as was useful, and then looked away. The program began at 8. Olivia took the stage to open the evening and spoke without notes, as she always did, for 6 minutes. About the foundation's work, about Carmen Reyes, about why financial literacy was not a women's issue, but a human one, and what it meant to build something real in a city that rewarded the performance of success over its substance. She did not look at Ethan while she spoke. She was not avoiding him. He simply wasn't the person the speech was for. The room was quiet and attentive in the specific way that rooms get when the person speaking is saying things that are real rather than crafted. She had given versions of this speech before, but something in it tonight was different, less polished, more direct. The particular clarity of someone who had spent 2 months examining what was real and what was constructed and had come through with stronger opinions about the distinction. When she sat down, the applause was the kind that takes a moment to begin and then builds, which was the best kind. Carmen Reyes gave her speech about her first client, a woman named Gloria who had come in with a shoebox of bills and no idea how to begin. And it was exactly as good as Olivia had hoped it would be. Direct and specific and human, with the kind of detail that only comes from actually having been there. And the room responded to it with the warmth that real things generate. Afterward, during the dinner portion of the evening, Olivia worked the room the way she always did, table to table, genuine and unhurried, talking about the programs and the scholarship endowment and what the foundation was planning for the next year. She was 3 tables from Ethan's when she heard it. It was not a scene. That was important to understand. It was not dramatic, not loud, not the kind of thing that stopped the room. It was a small thing that happened in the margin of the evening, the kind of thing most people didn't notice. A hotel staff member, one of the Whitmore's event coordinators, young, visibly uncomfortable, approached Ethan's table and spoke quietly to him. Ethan's expression shifted. He leaned in, said something, listened to the response, and then sat back with the particular stillness of a man absorbing unwelcome information. Vanessa, who had clearly heard some portion of it, leaned toward Ethan and said something in a low voice. He shook his head. She said something else. He put his hand briefly on her arm, the gesture of someone managing rather than comforting. Olivia learned what had happened later from Rose, who heard it from the event coordinator, the hotel suite that had been booked for the post-gala evening. A standard executive suite, the kind that clients of certain standing sometimes reserved for New York events, had been attempted on a corporate card that had been declined. The card was connected to a Caldwell Strategic account that had been restructured following the corporate separation from the Sterling Trust. The coordinator had come to confirm an alternative payment method. The suite would have cost $3,800 a night. It was not, in any absolute sense, an unaffordable amount for a man like Ethan Caldwell. But the specific card, the specific account, the specific declined transaction, in the specific venue where every significant person in his professional world was currently eating salmon and discussing charitable giving, The geometry of it was exact. Vanessa excused herself from the table 20 minutes later. She did not come back. Ethan remained at the table for the rest of the dinner, talking to his clients, performing the version of himself that the evening required. Olivia gave him credit for that. It was not easy, and he did it without visible collapse. But she noticed from across the room that the animation in him had flattened slightly. The specific quality of a man who is managing rather than inhabiting the evening he's in. She did not gloat. She was not built for gloating, and she would not have known how to begin even if she had been. But she did think, standing at table 6, talking to a woman who ran a community bank in Brooklyn, half listening and half watching the room, that there was a particular kind of truth that could not be managed or narrated or PR'd away. The truth of what things actually cost. The truth of what had been holding a certain life together and what happened when it was removed. The architecture, finally, fully visible. She was at the bar getting water at 9:45 when Davis Chen appeared beside her. She had known he was in the room, had seen him arrive with his wife at 7:30, and had expected this moment, or a version of it, at some point during the evening. "Olivia," he said. He was careful with her, always had been. Not warm, but careful, which in a man like Davis was its own form of respect. "Davis." He ordered a drink, looked at the room rather than at her, which was how he had always conducted difficult conversations, side by side rather than face to face. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," she said. "I'm genuinely fine, if that's what you're really asking." "I am really asking." He turned his glass in his hand. "I owe you an apology." She looked at him. "The press piece," he said. "The first one. I didn't commission it directly, but I introduced Ethan to the PR firm that did, and I knew what they were going to do, and I didn't stop it." He was looking at the room, not at her. "I told myself it was protecting the business, protecting the deal we'd been building, but it wasn't right, and I should have stopped it." She thought about the photograph, the profile shot, the caption, the woman who controlled the purse strings. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because the deal we were protecting fell apart anyway," he said, with a dryness that she recognized as the closest Davis Chen came to self-criticism. "And because you've been coming to events like this for a decade, and you have never in all that time done anything that deserved what we did." She looked at her water glass. She thought about what she wanted from this, from the apology, from Davis Chen, from this particular conversation at this particular bar, in this particular room. She thought she wanted exactly what she was getting, an honest account plainly stated without excessive decoration. "Thank you," she said. "I mean it." He nodded. "The Boston deal is restructured," he said. "Ethan knows the firm can survive without the Sterling relationship. It'll take time, but, Davis," she said it gently, "that's not my concern." He looked at her then, finally. "No," he said, "it isn't." He picked up his drink. "You've always been cleaner about those distinctions than the rest of us." She stayed at the bar for a moment after he moved away, thinking about what clean meant in a context like this. Not simple, not without cost, just honest about what was hers and what wasn't, what she was responsible for, and what she had to stop carrying because it had never been hers to carry. That was what clean meant. The gala officially ended at 10:30. The auction items had been sold, the pledges collected, the final speeches given. Carmen Reyes hugged Olivia at the end of the evening in the spontaneous, unselfconscious way of someone who had stopped thinking about the room and was just responding to the moment, and Olivia hugged her back and meant it. The guests thinned slowly, as they always did, and Olivia stayed until the last, not out of duty exactly, but because she never left her own events early, had never thought it was right to be the first person out the door of something you had built. She was talking to Rose about the breakdown schedule when she saw Ethan getting his coat near the entrance. He was alone. He had been alone for most of the last hour, his clients having departed in clusters, the social architecture of the evening having redistributed itself without him at the center. He caught her eye across the room. He didn't wave or nod or do anything that required a response. He just looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite name, not grief, not quite, and not guilt either. Something more settled than either of those, something that looked like the end of a long argument that a person has been having with themselves. Then he put on his coat and walked out. She watched the door close behind him and stood with that for a moment. The last 11 years condensed into a man in a dark suit walking out of a room she had built, and then she turned back to Rose and asked about the catering breakdown timeline, because the evening was not finished, and neither was she, and there was still work left to do. Outside, the December streets were wet with the slush that had been threatening all day. The city gray and glittering under it, taxis splashing through puddles, the particular beautiful mess of New York in winter. Paul was waiting at the curb, as he always was, and when she came through the doors, he had the car door open before she reached it. She got in. The door closed. The city moved around her. She thought about Carmen Reyes in front of a room of 500 people saying the name of a woman named Gloria who had come in with a shoebox of bills. She thought about what it meant to build something from nothing, and what it meant to build something from inheritance, and whether the difference was as large as people pretended or as small as she sometimes suspected. She thought about Ethan walking out of the Whitmore and what he was walking toward, and she found that she hoped it was something real, something actually his, built from what he actually was rather than what he had borrowed and resented. She thought about herself, about the apartment she was going back to, the work that would resume in the morning, the settlement that would be signed before Christmas, and the new year that would arrive shortly after, with all its ordinary, demanding, unspectacular promise. She did not feel triumphant. She had expected, somewhere in the last 2 months, that there might be a moment of triumph, a clean, satisfying sense of having won something. It had not come. What had come instead was more honest and more durable than triumph, the gradual, daily, incremental return of her own clarity. The ability to stand in a room and be fully present in it without part of her being occupied by the management of someone else's ego. The ability to make a decision without factoring in how it would make Ethan feel about himself. It was not glamorous. It was better than glamorous. Paul asked if she needed to stop anywhere on the way home. She said no, just home. And the car moved uptown through the wet December streets, and Olivia Sterling looked out the window at the city she had grown up in, and the city she intended to continue in, and felt, somewhere under the exhaustion and the residue of the evening, the specific quiet of a person who has finished one chapter and has not yet opened the next, but can feel the weight of it in their hands and is not afraid. The settlement was signed on the 23rd of December, 2 days before Christmas, in Margaret Chu's conference room on the 34th floor of a building on Park Avenue that looked out over the city in every direction. It was not a ceremonial signing. There was no particular solemnity to it, no moment where the weight of what was happening gathered itself and announced its significance. It was paperwork. A great deal of paperwork, executed in sequence, witnessed and notarized, with Margaret on one side of the table and Gerald Foss on the other, and Ethan and Olivia at opposite ends, both of them reading what they were signing rather than signing without reading, which was, Olivia thought, probably the most honest thing they had done together in years. Ethan arrived 7 minutes late. He apologized to Margaret, not to Olivia, which was appropriate given the context. He looked better than he had at the gala. Not well exactly, but more settled, as though the 3 weeks since that evening had given him time to absorb where he had landed and begin, however tentatively, to build something on that ground rather than fighting against it. The signing took 45 minutes. When it was done, Gerald Foss gathered his documents with the efficiency of a man who had closed files and was already mentally on to the next one. He shook Margaret's hand, shook Olivia's, nodded at Ethan, and left. Margaret excused herself briefly to speak to someone in the outer office, which Olivia suspected was not entirely accidental, a small professional act of courtesy that left the room quiet, and the two of them in it alone for the first time without attorneys managing the air between them. Ethan was looking at the signed documents stacked in front of him. He wasn't reading them. He was just looking at them the way you look at a thing when what you are really doing is trying to figure out what to do with your hands. "How are you?" he asked. He said it simply, without preface. "I'm all right," she said. "Better than all right, honestly. You look it." He said it without bitterness, which she appreciated. The gala it was a good evening. What you've built with the foundation, it's real. It always was. He nodded. He turned his pen over in his hand once, twice. "I've been thinking about what I said to you that night," he said, "at the Whitmore. Whether it was enough, whether any of it—" "Ethan." She said his name gently, The way you stop someone from going further down a road that doesn't lead anywhere useful. It was enough. It was what it was. We don't need to refine it. He looked at her. Do you ever think about what it would have been like if we'd just told each other the truth? From the beginning. All of it. She considered the question seriously. Sometimes, she said, but I don't think that version of events was available to us. We were both working with incomplete information about what we'd inherited. Not just money, the way our families had taught us to handle things. The things we'd been told mattered. She paused. We did the best we could with what we understood at the time. It wasn't good enough. That's what's true. He was quiet for a moment. I'm going to do better, he said. Not for you. I know that's not... He stopped. Started again. For myself. I need to figure out what I can actually build without leaning on someone else's structure. I think I've been afraid of that my whole adult life. I know, she said. I think you have too. It was not a cruel thing to say. It was simply accurate, and they had both earned enough honesty between them to speak it plainly. Good luck with it, she said, and meant it completely. Margaret came back into the room. The moment closed. Gerald Foss's assistant reappeared to collect the final copies. There was a brief, practical exchange about wire transfer timelines and notification procedures, and then it was over. The legal architecture of 11 years of marriage, fully dismantled, documented, and filed. Ethan put on his coat. He paused at the door. He did not say anything else, which was the right choice, and she was glad he made it. He left. Olivia sat for a moment in the conference room, alone, with the signed documents and the winter light coming in through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the city below doing what it always did, which was continue. She thought, that's done. Not with relief exactly, not with grief either, with the specific, unromantic satisfaction of a thing that needed to happen, having happened. The way you feel after a long project is finally delivered. Not elated, just finished and ready for whatever comes after finished. Margaret came back in and sat down across from her. She had a cup of coffee, and she set a second one in front of Olivia without asking, which was, after 9 years, the appropriate way to handle it. How are you feeling? Margaret asked. Like it's December 23rd, and I haven't bought a single gift, Olivia said. Margaret almost smiled. You have 2 days. I'm aware. She picked up the coffee. Thank you, Margaret, for all of it, not just the documents. That's the job. Some of it was more than the job. Margaret looked at her over her reading glasses with the expression of a woman who did not accept sentimentality at work but was making a brief exception. You were a good client, she said. You knew what you wanted, you didn't change your mind, and you never asked me to do anything that made me uncomfortable. She paused. In 25 years, that's rarer than it should be. Olivia drank her coffee. Outside, the sky was the particular pale gray of a New York winter afternoon, the city below it dense and moving and entirely occupied with itself. She watched it for a moment, and then she gathered her coat and her bag, and she went home. The new year arrived the way New Year's do, with noise and then sudden quiet, the city loud at midnight and strangely subdued by morning, as though it had spent everything it had on the countdown and needed a day to recover. Olivia spent New Year's Eve with Sophie Carraway and 4 other women she had known for long enough that no performance was required. Dinner at Sophie's apartment in the West Village, good wine, the kind of conversation that moved easily between serious and ridiculous and back again without anyone managing the transitions. At midnight, they stood on Sophie's small terrace and watched the distant fireworks over the park, and someone opened a second bottle of something and nobody made any toasts because they had all known each other long enough to know that the year ahead would be whatever it was, and speeches didn't change it. Olivia got home at 1:30 and went to bed and slept deeply, which was what she had been doing now, with a consistency that still occasionally surprised her. She had not understood, until it was gone, how much of her sleep she had spent processing the low-grade maintenance work of a marriage in trouble, the unconscious running of calculations, the nighttime management of anxieties she wasn't consciously acknowledging during the day. Without that, sleep was simply sleep, dark and restorative and complete. January brought the deposition. It was not, in the end, a legal deposition. The settlement had precluded that. It was something more informal and, in some ways, more demanding. A request from the Sterling Family Foundation's board to conduct an internal review of the foundation's governance and asset management in light of the public attention the family name had received in the preceding months. It was a reasonable request, driven partly by genuine fiduciary responsibility and partly by the specific nervousness of board members who had watched the coverage and wanted assurance that the foundation's reputation was not entangled in the personal narrative. Olivia understood this. She also found it mildly exhausting, the way it was always exhausting to have to demonstrate your competence to the same room twice when you had already demonstrated it once. She presented to the full board in the third week of January a comprehensive review of the foundation's financials, program outcomes, governance structure, and forward plan for the next 3 years. She did it without notes, the way she always did it, and she answered every question directly, including the uncomfortable ones, including the one that a board member named Gerald Park, well-meaning, slightly anxious, asked about whether the Sterling name's recent press coverage had impacted donor relationships. 2 donors paused their pledges in October, she said. Both resumed in December after the Patricia Holt piece in the financial press. 1 increased their pledge. The foundation's reputation among our core stakeholders is intact. If anything, the last few months have demonstrated that the foundation's work is independent of my personal life, which I would argue is the correct relationship between an institution and the people who run it. Gerald Park nodded and wrote something. The board voted to conclude the review with no further action. The meeting ended. It was only afterward, standing in the lobby waiting for Paul, that Olivia allowed herself to feel the full weight of having had to do that at all, having had to stand in front of her foundation's board and account for herself because Ethan's affair and her response to it had been turned into a story about her character. She let herself be briefly, privately angry about it. Not at the board, who had done the right thing by asking, at the general condition of being a woman in a public role, where your personal life is treated as evidence about your professional fitness in a way that would never, not once, be applied to a man in the same position. She let herself be angry. She did not carry it into the car. In February, she received a letter. It came by actual mail, paper, envelope, a Connecticut postmark, and was written in the slightly formal handwriting of a man in his 70s who had learned to write when handwriting was still taught as a discipline. It was from Douglas Caldwell. He did not say a great deal. The letter was 4 paragraphs, precise and unadorned. He said that he had followed the resolution of the situation with relief. He said that he understood he owed her more than an apology for his role in what had begun in 2011, but that he was aware an apology was all he had to offer. He said that the decision his son had made at 28, to marry her despite knowing the circumstances, to keep that knowledge from her, was his son's decision, and not one he could apologize for on Ethan's behalf. But the original arrangement, the conversation with Harrison Sterling, the careful management of the conditions under which 2 young people had met and been encouraged toward each other, that was his. He took responsibility for it without qualification. In the final paragraph, he said that he had been wrong about what he was protecting in 2011. He had thought he was protecting his family's name. He understood now that what he had actually done was compromise his son's ability to know what he was capable of on his own, and that this had been the more damaging injury, not to the company, not even to the marriage, but to Ethan's own sense of himself. It was the most honest thing anyone connected to Ethan had said to her in the course of all of this, and she sat with it for a long time after she finished reading it. She wrote back. Not immediately. She let a week pass because she wanted to write from a considered place rather than a reactive one. Her letter was shorter than his. She said she appreciated his honesty. She said she did not think forgiveness was hers to extend on behalf of her father, who was not here to speak for himself, but that she understood Douglas had acted from a place of desperation rather than malice, and that the distinction mattered to her. She said she hoped Ethan would find, over time, what his father was describing, the knowledge of what he was capable of without a borrowed foundation underneath him. She mailed it on a Wednesday morning and didn't think about it again. The first speaking invitation arrived in March from a financial literacy nonprofit in Philadelphia that had seen coverage of the Sterling Foundation's work and wanted Olivia to speak at their annual fundraising luncheon. It was a modest event, 200 people, a hotel ballroom in Center City, and under normal circumstances, she would have sent a donation and a representative from the foundation's communications team. She said yes. She said yes because Dina had pointed out in one of their last conversations that the most durable response to a false narrative was not a correction, but a demonstration. That every room Olivia walked into and spoke plainly in was a room where the controlling billionaire frame had less purchase. And she said yes because Carmen Reyes had made her think, at the gala, about the difference between giving money to a cause and actually inhabiting it. She flew to Philadelphia on a Thursday, spoke for 22 minutes, took questions for another 15, and flew back the same afternoon. She talked about the Sterling Foundation's scholarship program. She talked about what she had learned from the women the foundation served, the specific courage required to examine your own financial situation clearly when the examination was frightening, and the specific liberation that followed the examination once you had done it. She did not talk about her marriage. She did not talk about Ethan. Those were her business, and more than that, they were beside the point. The point being something larger than her particular story, which was only interesting insofar as it was not actually particular, insofar as it was a version of something that happened to women in every income bracket and every city and every circumstance in which someone else controlled access to a resource and used that control, consciously or not, to define the shape of a life. The second invitation came from a women's financial conference in Chicago. The third from a university's business school in Boston, where they wanted her for a panel on inherited wealth, governance, and family business structures. The fourth from a podcast that she had listened to for years and whose host was a woman she had always respected. She did not say yes to all of them. She was not interested in building a speaking career or a personal brand out of what had happened to her marriage, but she said yes to the ones where she had something to actually contribute, where the conversation was substantive rather than performative, where she could say something true and useful rather than something that simply sounded good. Dina, when Olivia told her about the Chicago conference, said, "You understand this is a bigger shift than it sounds." "I know," Olivia said. "You've spent your whole adult life being very private. This is different." "I know that too." Olivia thought about it. "But I've been private for the right reasons and the wrong reasons, and I've been having trouble lately distinguishing between them. Being private to protect what was genuinely mine. That was right. Being private because Ethan was uncomfortable when I was visible. That was something else." Dina looked at her for a long moment. "When did you figure that out?" "Somewhere around November," Olivia said. "I'm slow." "You're not slow," Dina said. "It took what it took, man." In April, she did something she had been thinking about since December. She took the watch out of its box. It had been sitting on the bedroom dresser, the guest room dresser, which had become simply her dresser now, the guest room having become simply her room, since the night she had come home from the restaurant and put it there. She had moved it twice, once when she was cleaning, once when she thought she might finally deal with it, and then didn't. It was a beautiful watch. The craftsmanship was exact. The engraving on the back said what it said. To E. You built this. Oh. She held it in her hand for a while, in the April morning light that came through the guest room, her room, window, and fell across the dresser in a wide, pale stripe. She thought about the afternoon she had spent choosing it, the thought she had put into it, the care, the genuine belief, when she had asked for the engraving, that what she was saying was true, that Ethan had built something real, something of his own, something that deserved to be acknowledged. She had been wrong about that, in the specific way the engraving described it. He had not built it. Not alone. Not really. But she had not been wrong about the impulse behind it, the desire to recognize someone, to say, "I see what you're doing, and I think it matters." That impulse was not wrong. It had been directed incorrectly, toward a version of Ethan that was partly real and partly a construction she had participated in maintaining. But the impulse itself was one of the better things about her. She put the watch back in the box. She did not throw it away. She put it in the drawer of the bedside table where it was out of sight but not gone, because she was not yet sure what the right thing to do with it was. And she had learned in the last 6 months that sitting with uncertainty was not the same as failing to decide. Ethan called in May. She almost didn't pick up. Not from avoidance. She had nothing to avoid anymore. No unfinished emotional business that made his name on the screen feel threatening. She almost didn't pick up because she was in the middle of reviewing grant applications for the foundation's next cycle, and her concentration was on the documents, and she had to actively choose to set the documents aside and answer. "I wanted to tell you something," he said, "and I wasn't sure whether to call or not, but I decided—" He paused. "I decided you deserved to hear it from me." "Okay," she said. "I've been in therapy since January, which I know it's late, and I know that it doesn't change anything between us, but I wanted you to know because I think you always thought I needed it, and I spent years being too proud to admit you were right." She was quiet. "My therapist asked me to write down the things I was most ashamed of," he said. "Not to share them, just to write them. And I wrote a lot of things. But the one I kept coming back to was not the affair. It was the watch." He stopped. "You had that engraved for me. You came to that restaurant to celebrate something I had only partly done myself, and you were holding a gift that said you thought I built it. And I was sitting there with Vanessa, and I—" His voice was careful, controlled, the control of a man who had decided to say a thing and was going to say it. "That was the worst thing I did. Not the affair. That." She had not expected this to affect her the way it did. She sat in the May now, she had to keep adjusting, May light in her kitchen, and felt something move through her that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but lived somewhere between them, the specific feeling of being finally accurately seen by someone who had spent years looking past you. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry for it." "I know that too." A pause. "How are you?" he asked. "Good," she said, and it was true in a way it had not been when she last said it to him. "I've been saying yes to things I spent a long time saying no to. Speaking, mostly, about the foundation's work and adjacent things." She stopped. "I'm finding that I have things to say." "You always did," he said. "I just didn't always leave room for it." That landed. She let it. "How are you?" she asked. "Building," he said, slowly, without— He stopped, and she could hear him choose his next word carefully. "Without the scaffolding I used to need, it's slower. It's also more honest." "That matters," she said. "Yeah." A pause. "Vanessa and I ended in February. I don't say that for any reason except I thought you should know in the interest of the complete picture." "Thank you for telling me." "I didn't love her," he said. "I think I knew that before the gala. I think I might have known it a long time before that." "I know," she said, and she did know, had known since the restaurant when he'd said exactly that. "I'm not in love with her," in the voice of a man confessing something he found more shameful than the affair itself. They talked for a few more minutes. Practical things. A question about a piece of furniture he'd left in storage that was technically from her family's household, but that she genuinely didn't want back, and she told him to keep it or sell it or give it away. She didn't care. He said he'd probably donate it somewhere. She said that sounded right. When they hung up, she sat for a moment in the kitchen and then went back to the grant applications because there was real work in front of her and she had people depending on decisions she was making, and that mattered more now and always than sitting with the residue of a conversation that had said what it needed to say and was finished. She gave the Chicago speech in June. The conference was larger than the Philadelphia luncheon. 600 people, a formal ballroom, the kind of event with a printed program and name badges and the slightly electric quality of a room full of people who have chosen to spend their time on something they believe in. The topic she had been asked to address was framed as financial independence and the women who build it, which was broad enough that she had spent 2 weeks deciding what, specifically, she actually wanted to say. She stood at the podium and looked at the room for a moment before she began. 600 faces, mostly women, mostly at the stage of life where they had already made the important decisions and were living inside them, or were trying to revise the important decisions, which was its own kind of courage. She did not use notes. "I want to talk about what it means to understand your own resources," she said, "and why that understanding is so frequently characterized as a threat." She talked for 30 minutes. She talked about the Sterling Foundation and what it had taught her. Not the money, but the women the money served. The specific patterns she had observed in 12 years of funding financial literacy programs, the way that financial opacity functioned as a form of control and financial clarity functioned as a form of freedom. She talked about inherited wealth and the specific complications it introduced, the guilt, the obligation, the way it could be weaponized by others and sometimes by the people who held it. She talked about the difference between protecting your resources and using them as a substitute for engagement, and how easy it was to mistake one for the other in both directions. She did not tell her own story, not directly, but she talked about what it meant to be in a situation where the resources you thought were shared turned out to be yours, and what it meant to understand that clearly, and what the world tended to call a woman who understood her own resources clearly, and what that said about the world rather than about the woman. The room was very quiet, the specific quiet of 600 people who have stopped checking their phones. She said, "The women I have learned the most from in 12 years of this work were not the women who were most financially secure. They were the women who were most honest, the ones who sat down, sometimes for the first time in their lives, and looked at exactly what they had, and what they owed, and what belonged to them, and what they had been carrying that wasn't theirs to carry. That process of looking, clear-eyed, without the stories we tell ourselves to make the picture more comfortable, is the bravest financial act I know. And it is worth noting that we rarely describe it as brave. We describe it as cold. We describe it as controlling. We describe it as unfeminine." She paused. "It is none of those things. It is simply true. And true is the only foundation that holds." After the speech, a woman came up to her in the crowd, 50s, well-dressed, a Midwestern straightforwardness in the way she moved through a room, and said without preamble, "I left my husband 3 years ago because I finally understood what was mine and what wasn't. I wish I'd had someone say what you just said 10 years earlier." Olivia looked at her. "What would you have done differently?" The woman thought about it. "I would have looked sooner," she said. "I kept thinking that looking meant accepting that something was wrong, but the looking was the thing that was going to fix it, one way or another. I was afraid of what I'd see." "Most people are," Olivia said. "Were you?" She thought about the restaurant, the hostess at the front, the rerouted reservation, the bar stool near the far end with the good sight lines. She thought about the stillness she had felt, standing in the entrance of Claridge's Manhattan, watching her husband tuck a strand of hair behind another woman's ear. The clarity of it. The way it had not felt like the beginning of a disaster, but like the end of a long, low-grade uncertainty. "No," she said. "And I used to wonder about that, why I wasn't more afraid. But I think it's because I'd spent 11 years being very careful not to look at certain things. And by the time I finally looked, I was too tired of not looking to be frightened by what I saw." The woman nodded slowly. "That's it exactly," she said. "That's exactly it." The divorce had been final since January. The settlement had been signed in December. The paperwork was done, the assets were separated, the accounts were clean. But the thing that Olivia had been surprised to discover was that the end of a marriage was not a single event. It was a process, gradual and uneven, of disentangling yourself from a version of your own life. There were days in the spring when she walked through the apartment and found things that felt like evidence of a different existence. A book she had bought because Ethan mentioned liking it. A coffee mug from a hotel in a city they'd visited together. The Florence photograph, which she had eventually taken off the wall but not thrown away, which was in a box in the closet, which she would deal with eventually. There was no clean line. She had known, intellectually, that there would not be. What she had not expected was how it coexisted with everything else. The work, the foundation, the Chicago speech, the conversations with women she was learning from, the new rhythms of a life that was entirely hers to arrange. The coexistence was not comfortable exactly, but it was honest. It was the texture of real things rather than the false smoothness of things that had been resolved prematurely. She did not date. This was not a decision she made dramatically or publicly. It was simply that she was not interested yet, and she had stopped treating her own disinterest as something to be managed or explained. She had time. She had work she cared about. She had, for the first time in a long time, the full use of her own company, and she found it considerably less lonely than it had been when she was sharing a life with someone who wasn't actually present in it. Sophie, on a Sunday afternoon in early summer, on a bench in the park, said, "You're different." Olivia was watching a dog chase something it was never going to catch. Different how? You take up more space, Sophie said. Not in an obnoxious way, just you used to edit yourself, even with me sometimes, like you were calibrating how much of you to let into a room. She paused. You don't do that anymore. Olivia thought about this. She thought about all the rooms she had calibrated herself in, not just with Ethan, but before Ethan, with her father, with the particular culture of wealth and restraint she had been raised inside, where being too much was considered a greater failure than being too little. The training had been so early and so consistent that she had not always been able to identify it as training. It had felt like character. It had felt like her. She did not know, entirely, where the training ended, and she began. She suspected that was a question without a clean answer. But she was, at 43, considerably more interested in finding out than she had been at 31. When she had married a man at a dinner arranged by two fathers who thought they knew what their children needed and had turned out to be wrong in ways that had taken 11 years to fully surface. I'm working on it, she said. I know, Sophie said. It looks good on you. The Sterling Family Foundation's annual report came out in August, covering the previous year's work. It was a document Olivia had always been involved in closely, not the design, which she left to people who understood design, but the content, the specific decisions about what the year's work had meant and how to describe it to the people who supported it. This year she wrote the opening letter herself, from scratch, without drafts from the communications team. She wrote it in the kitchen in the early morning with coffee she remembered to finish, and she wrote it about honesty, about what financial honesty meant and what it cost and what it returned. She wrote about Carmen Reyes and Gloria and the shoebox of bills. She wrote about the women in the foundation's programs who had sat down and looked at their actual numbers for the first time and reported consistently that the looking was both worse and better than they had expected. Worse because the reality was often harder than the story they had been telling. Better because the story had been taking more from them than the reality. She wrote, "There is a particular kind of strength in looking clearly at what you have and what you owe and what belongs to you. It does not require that everything be all right. It only requires that you be willing to see what is actually there. We have been in the business at this foundation of making that kind of seeing possible for women who had been told, in one way or another, that they were better off not looking. Our work says otherwise. Our work says that the truth of what you have is the only ground that holds. Everything else is borrowed." She read it over once. She sent it to the communications team without changes. The report was published in August. A foundation board member forwarded it to 3 colleagues. One of those colleagues mentioned it to Patricia Holt, who mentioned it briefly in her column as an example of a foundation that had found a way to speak about its mission without abstraction. Olivia did not track the mention beyond that, because the letter had said what she wanted to say, and what happened to it afterward was its own business. On the first genuinely warm evening of September, she sat on the terrace of the apartment, a small terrace off the living room that she had always liked and had never, somehow, spent enough time on, with a glass of wine and no particular plan. The city was doing its September thing, which was the best of its things. The light going gold and long, the park below green and crowded, the sense of a new season arriving without the cruelty of winter. She had a board meeting in the morning and a call with the Chicago conference organizers in the afternoon about the following year's program, and somewhere in the week ahead she needed to make a decision about the Florence photograph, which had been in the closet long enough. She thought she might keep it, not displayed, not on the hallway wall, not anywhere that made it a statement, but in the box, in the closet, the way you keep evidence of a thing that happened and mattered and is over. She had been happy in that photograph. The happiness had been real. Whatever else was complicated. It didn't require resolution or renunciation. It just required honest accounting. This happened, it meant what it meant, it is finished, and I am here. She was here. She drank her wine and watched the light move across the park and thought about what the next year would look like. More speaking, probably. A significant expansion of the scholarship endowment that she and the board had been planning since spring. A trip she had been considering, not for any particular reason except that she had not traveled for pleasure alone, for pleasure that was entirely hers, in longer than she could easily remember, and she was ready to do it. Somewhere she had chosen because she wanted to be there and for no other reason. She thought about the woman in Chicago who had said I would have looked sooner. She thought about what it had taken for that woman to look, not the courage exactly, though courage was part of it, but the specific willingness to accept that looking and acting on what you saw were the only forms of loyalty to yourself that could not be taken from you. Everything else, money, property, reputation, the narrative that other people wrote about your life in digital publications between dinner and sleep, all of that could be contested and managed and distorted. But the looking was yours. What you understood about your own situation, what you were willing to name clearly, what you refused to pretend was different from what it was, that belonged to no one else. She had looked. It had cost her things she had genuinely valued. It had also returned to her things she had not understood she had lost until they came back. The full use of her own clarity, the right to take up the exact amount of space she occupied without editing, the daily, ordinary, unspectacular experience of being wholly and accurately herself. This was not a triumph. She was not standing at the top of anything. She was sitting on a terrace in September with a glass of wine and a week of work ahead of her and a closet with a photograph in it and a drawer with a watch in it and 11 years of a complicated life behind her and however many were ahead. But she was not supporting a lie anymore. She was not managing someone else's version of who she was, or maintaining a structure built on a foundation neither of them had examined, or giving the careful, calibrated portion of herself that left enough room for someone else's ego to breathe. She was just here, fully, without reservation, without apology. The city went gold and then amber, and then the particular deep blue of a September evening when the lights come on all at once across Manhattan and the park goes dark at its center and bright at its edges, and Olivia Sterling sat on her terrace and watched it and did not feel the need to be anywhere other than where she was. That was enough. That was in fact everything.